Voila, there we go. So welcome to episode 167, the Quarkus Effect. And this is a so one. In case we have Richard Fontana, who's a lawyer and not a software engineer, as we normally have as guests. But Richard is special because, well, not just because he's a lawyer, but he's a lawyer with a GitHub account, which is a rare thing. And what's even more special is almost 10 years ago, so in September 2013, we did an episode where we talked about licenses on what was called the JBoss Asylum podcast. And then a while ago, I was like, hey, we should have a follow-up because a few things probably changed around licenses. So that's what.
One or two.
Yeah, one or two. So as always, if you have questions, you just ask them in. And today, Richard hasn't. There's no technical demo or that kind of thing. So we have some questions for him, but you are all welcome to ask questions about anything. And I'm sure Richard will say sometimes that he is a lawyer, but he's not your lawyer, or that kind of thing. So, Richard, can you maybe just introduce yourself and fill in the blanks, whatever I missed about you, except lawyer and a GitHub account?
Yeah, so I don't actually really use the GitHub account for that much. But when I did, so I don't know when I actually got the GitHub account, but I think at that time it wasn't that common for lawyers to have GitHub accounts. I think it's slightly more common now. So maybe I was like a little bit of a pioneer, but it's not exactly for show. It's just that I don't have I'm busy doing like other kinds of things. I have a GitLab account actually as well, which I use like a little more often because I use it for some Red Hat related stuff. So anyway, I don't know if you mentioned that I'm at Red Hat. I'm a lawyer at Red Hat, so that's
small detail.
So I guess that's what I would say. Like I've been at Red Hat like for kind of a long time now. Not for like the entire past 15 or 16 years, but for most of the past 15 or 16 years. I've been and like throughout that time I've been like I would characterize my role as it's kind of like certainly like a big part of what I do relates to open source development. So Red Hat has an open source development model, and so a lot of interesting kinds of questions come up and issues come up around that, legal issues. But I think in a sort of broader sense, I tend to provide a lot of different types of legal support to Red Hat engineers. I mean, not just engineers, but in some ways that's what's a little bit special about my role within the Red Hat legal team.
Yeah, and I took the time this morning to listen to our episode, and actually one of the questions I had back then 10 years ago was like you are a lawyer with a GitHub account, and if other lawyers had the same thing, and your answer was basically that you felt you there was very few lawyers you knew that had it, and even you said that there's even lawyers who didn't know what GitHub is at the time. Has that changed?
Yeah, so I think it's changed a little bit. It hasn't changed that much. So okay. I think what we have now are a slightly larger number of lawyers, at least that I kind of interact with, who have more kind of knowledge, like kind of direct knowledge of like programming and like somewhat deeper knowledge about software engineering and so forth than was the case, 10 or 15 years ago. But it's not a huge change by any means.
So what would so is there anything well, first of all, I think maybe we should because I know this is a hot topic, and back then we also talked about like what is actually open source, because I think that 10 years ago it was a very, let's say, unknown. I'm not saying unknown, but it was like lesser known. Now I think most people are getting it, but I still think people are trying to morph it. um, so, and it's like, can you just, when you say something is open source, what is it to you? Just so we on the paper on the record speaking. So
Yeah, that's actually become that hasn't stopped being a major question. That's become more of
yeah,
a significant question in the years since
exactly.
the JBoss Asylum podcast.
Yeah,
So no, it's a good question. To me, the way I like to describe this, there is a kind of combination legal and technical culture around open source and open source development. And part of that is expectations around the availability of source code. Like what source code actually is. Oddly is itself kind of a can sometimes be a difficult question, but it's not just the availability of source code. It's also the set of legal permissions you have to use the software that is claimed to be open source. And so there's sort of a minimum set of permissions you have to have for something to be legitimately open source. And why is it that set of permissions? That is what I'm kind of calling a culture, a set of expectations that grew out of a community or a set of closely associated communities over a long period of time. So those expectations include just for example, well, so we can talk about the free software definition. So the Free Software Foundation has something they call the free software definition, which gets at this concept, even though they don't like to use the term open source. They prefer to use the term free software, but they have like a very simple definition, which is I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but it's freedom. So the permissions you have to have for something to be free software is need permission, freedom to use the software for any purpose, to to make modifications to the software for any reason, and that presupposes access to the source code, to share the software with anyone, so the right to distribute, and the right to share your improvements or modifications, which again kind of assumes that you've had access to the source code, so you could make those modifications and can share those modifications. So it's a combination of legal permissions and kind of technical criteria, namely the access to source code, that I think makes something open source. And there's also an organization called the Open Source Initiative. So in the years since we did the JBoss Asylum podcast, for part of that period, I was actually on the board of the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, and during much of that period, I was the chair of their license review committee. So the one of the things they do is they approve licenses as sort of meeting their open source definition, and they have a more complex definition. It's a 10-part definition, but we kind of assume that it's getting at the same kind of underlying concept as the free software definition. It's just a little more complicated. And part of that definition, which is kind of useful, is this idea of non-discrimination. So there are these two parts of the definition that say the license can't discriminate against persons or groups, and the license can't discriminate against fields of endeavor. We haven't actually explained what a license is, but a license is so there are software is subject to sets of different types of legal rights. And the most important one for software development is probably, well, definitely copyright, but there's also like patents and other things like that. Um, so so copyright kind of aligns pretty closely with what you're trying to do in open source. But it's sort of in the opposite way. So copyright is sort of a way of giving an author of software the right to prevent other people from doing stuff with it. So preventing people from making copies, preventing people from distributing the software. So a license is giving permission to people to do things you could otherwise stop them from doing. That's basically what a license is. So a lot of what when we try to kind of understand the definition of open source, it's largely focused on like what should be in a license. So again, that sort of minimum set of permissions is a set of permissions that should be embodied in a software license.
Yeah, and I remember the 10 year ago we mentioned freedoms, right? So this is what you said. Like you had the freedom to use it, the freedom to distribute it, and freedom to use it to almost like to anything you want, basically. And one one example we talked about that back then was like there's these fun licenses like the WTF license, what is like which is an open source license because it just gives you all allowed to. But there's also the one that was JSON license, which is like you can do this, you can use this for good but not evil. That is not an open source license. At least that was said 10 years ago, and I assume it's the same today.
Yeah, so
And
that's right. And one of the things that JSON license, which I think started out as basically a joke. I've never been entirely clear on this.
yeah,
But but license is similar in spirit to that license. So that license is the MIT license plus an additional clause that says the software shall be used for good, not evil, with good like capital G, and I think evil is capital E. Doesn't define what good and evil are, but in a certain sense, that was a forerunner to a whole movement that started up some years later, which is called the ethical source movement. And that is a movement of people actually kind of coming out of like authentic open source communities who very much like think of themselves as open source contributors, open source developers, open source project maintainers, who feel that this idea that open source licenses can't discriminate against uses and categories of people, but that in a sense that is fundamentally wrong because they believe that licenses should actually promote certain types of social and political policies and objectives that are achieved by restrictions in the license. So for example, they might be in favor of licenses that um, prohibit just an example, like prohibit uh, uses of software that are harmful to the environment. That would not
yeah,
be a license that would meet the open source definition or the free software definition because it discriminates against fields of
yeah,
endeavor.
yeah,
Um, so I think it's interesting to think about why, like those of us who are kind of inside the open source system, as I understand it, like the open source license system, kind of understand why that is not open source, but it can be challenging to kind of justify that because it kind of exposes that the roots of open source are in this time period when there was a community belief that licenses should grant freedom to everyone and freedom for all possible uses, even for harmful uses. There's a belief that, and I think it's sort of like helpful to think about these licenses as trying to encourage the creation of software that are like what's called public goods in some context. So these are things that everyone in society should be able to benefit from, even bad people. Like there's certainly a case for regulation of software development, but licenses themselves should not be engaged in what's the proper kind of province of the legislature or regulators. It's licenses should not be kind of doing that. So that's one of the important things that happened in the past 10 or 15 years, that the emergence of that sort of movement, kind of as a splinter movement within the open source movement. So the JSON license, to it kind of get back to the JSON license. The JSON license kind of faded away in a sense, but much more serious licenses sprang up in its place.
yeah. Well, I want to take this one because there's a question or comment which I actually think is very telling. So this is just Guava Things. Not sure what his real name is. He says, simply put, if a random individual can contribute to it, it's open source. And I think that's something that many people think is true, but I can see it's, well, I know that there's a lot of open source out there that you can't contribute to. Like there are actually projects that give the source out and this don't let you can do all the change you want to, but you can't contribute back, for example. Like I think the most one is like SQLite. I think especially has like we will not take any any PR or stuff in. You just take what we give you, kind of thing. That is open source. But then you're gonna go like also just because the source is open, so you have access to it, is that open source? Well, no, because you could be on like a shared source license or something where the code is there, but you're not allowed to use it for anything. And that's what gets into what you're saying. You mentioned here the WTF, oh sorry, the JSON do evil, do good license, and you mentioned the ethical thing, which, for example, not be harmful to the environment, which is very hard. That means that almost any software that has requires energy can be argued to be against the environment. That means that that software probably can't be used in Amazon or Google or any clouds kind of setup. Or the one I think I've seen few say I not allowed to be used for military. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, where does the border go? That's probably, isn't there some licenses like cannot be used in nuclear facilities, that kind of thing? Wasn't that in an open
Java
source license?
always used to have that. The early versions of Java said, please don't use Java to run a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
Yeah, this issue does come up. So there are some licenses that have statements about use in nuclear facilities inside a warranty disclaimer. So commonly, software licenses, not just open source licenses, but all software licenses, like most of them have these attempts to disclaim warranty. So this is sort of trying to basically limit the exposure of the author of the software to certain types of liability. It's kind of a kind of very mature concept in sort of consumer law and the law around the sale of goods, and it kind of affected the way software licenses are written. So the view that some of us developed is that if you have a statement about nuclear facilities inside a warranty disclaimer, so something like um, this software is not designed for use in a nuclear facility, that's probably okay. But if it's outside the warranty disclaimer, then it's kind of a use restriction, and that would not be
Yeah.
an open source license. And I think there were different versions of this license that Sun Microsystems used that had that kind of language, and some of them we would consider, or I would consider open source today. Some of them I would not consider open source, depending on like where, like
Right.
what exactly it says and where that language is in the license.
Because then these, let's call them, well, the do no evil and eco-friendly or against military. But then there's other, I'm not sure it's the same thing, but different angle is the what do you call it? Like there's a lot of license. Well, I don't want to say a lot. There's been several occurrences in the last 10 years of companies who start out as following open source licenses and then decide, hey, this is not good for us. We need some kind of protection. And there's a bunch of different ones, and I'm probably going to botch some of them, but there's eventual source, open source. Line one says, hey, this code is open source, but it's not going to be under it's going to be on like the business, or what's called a BSL or
business source license.
Yeah, where after 3 years it's under a patch or something like. So this is like I'm not sure it's called a time bomb, but it's like oh, it's the argument's like this is like effectively it's open source because eventually it'll be available. But that means that right now it's not. Right? It's only in 3 years, and then there's stuff like, well, how do you handle CVEs and fixes? Um, but that's other. Most of them comes down back to this thing where they say um, is, and then even when it's open source, there's this type of like, and let's just Elasticsearch is a common one, like where it says, and then you're allowed to do everything you want with this, as long as not competing with like a search function or XYZ function. That category is basically the same thing, right? Like the you're setting a signal use, and it's not even like a specific one. It's whatever. Yeah, wait a minute, I'm probably speaking. Like, what's the challenge with those? Why are they not called open source? Because the source is
Yeah.
open, everyone can contribute the
Yeah.
whole thing.
Yeah. So this is another major development of the past 10 years around kind of open source ish licenses, because these are not, these are not open source licenses that we're talking about. So in some ways much more significant than the ethical source licenses that we were mentioning. In a certain sense, they have the same problem from a kind of traditional open source perspective, because these licenses, they may have like multiple deficiencies from an open source perspective, but the main deficiency is that they contain certain types of discriminations or limitations on types of use, limitations on categories of users. So for example, you mentioned the idea of a license that prohibits use in competition with us, or competitive use. So that's kind of typical. So many have come to call those licenses source available licenses, and that in a sense is a broader term that embraces also like the ethical source licenses that we were mentioning. But that's actually been a somewhat successful introduction of terminology. I think that that's caught on quite a bit, but it's really open source advocates who have tried to, or I guess I would say traditional open source advocates who have tried to insist on this difference between open source and source available. So these licenses, broadly speaking, they all are aimed at um, protecting against competition. But open source licenses are designed to facilitate competition, I would say. Like that is part of the freedoms you get with open source. You get the freedom to compete. You get the freedom to make forks. That's a fundamental freedom of open source, and those forks could be competitive to the original project. The forks could be commercially competitive with respect to the original project, right? Um, so that's the problem with those licenses. So some of those licenses, many of those licenses have been used by projects. There's a certain profile of project that has tended to adopt those types of licenses. They tend to be startups or smaller companies, kind of that were um, kind of uh, started up around a specific project that kind of got popular. So the project was put under an open source license, got typically like the Apache license, or typically a very permissive license. The software got very popular, got a kind of big community around it, in part because it was open source. And then at some later period, the company that kind of controls the project switches the license to something too restrictive to be an open source license. So one of these source available licenses, and sometimes it is justified as a response to the leveraging of the software by large cloud providers. So some have called these kinds of licenses, or some of these kinds of licenses, anti-strip mining licenses. So the view is that big cloud providers would take these little projects maintained by little companies and strip mine them, build SaaS services around them, monetize the projects with supposedly without contributing upstream. Although as you note, like there are projects that make it difficult or impossible to contribute And often, I would say, often these kinds of projects are among those, right? Um, um, but that's kind of been the profile. And yeah, you mentioned a few of these. One of the first ones was the business source license, which you mentioned. Another one, a little bit different from most of them, is the SSPL, the server side public license that MongoDB initiated, and that actually has come to be used by a number of other companies that kind of fit this profile. So, if I'm
Uh,
not mistaken, Redis, that's one of the licenses that Redis recently adopted, and
The
I think
SSPL is the one where it's open source, but if you use it on the server side, you have to make all your dependencies open source, right? That's the
yeah, so that right, that is an interesting license because it doesn't contain any explicit use restrictions, and it doesn't contain any explicit classifications against types of users, unlike the other kinds of licenses we've been talking about. In a sense, the discriminations are more implicit. So the SSPL says, as you pointed out, you basically have to kind of release your entire stack implementing your service under the SSPL. This is effectively impossible to do because there isn't an ecosystem of SSPL software that would enable you to do this. And so, at least I would argue that one of the reasons why this license is not open source is that it is in effect a license that prohibits actually against most uses because you can't at least it discriminates against use in a service, which is you ought to be able to you ought to be able to under an open source license you ought to be able to create a service around the software, including a commercial service. And the SSPL is in effect a prohibition on that because it makes it impossible to comply with the license if you do that. Another reason why that license is problematic is that so this is not explicit in the FSF's free software definition, but in the open source definition of the OSI, there is uh, section 9 or plank 9, which says the software. I'm paraphrasing it from memory. The software shall not the license shall not restrict other software, so separate software, independent software. This is kind of a basic principle in open source that licenses cannot purport to reach everything. So a license has said that everything in your operating system has to be open sourced would not be an open source license because it goes too far, and that's what the SSPL does. It reaches software that would traditionally be considered independent software.
and how does that, just to spell out, because GPL is a license that are by many understood as being, let's call it, infectious or like affecting others. But I assume there's a difference between that and what you are saying.
Yeah, so the GPL is a very interesting license. Of course, it it is. I would say the GPL kind of expresses the limit of what a true open source license can do in terms of like what kinds of restrictions it can impose. So the GPL represents a kind of it's not really the true outer bound because there are actually other licenses that are somewhat more restrictive than the GPL in certain respects that we would look at and say, yeah, this is kind of maybe a little bit borderline, but this is probably open source. There are licenses that are in this kind of fuzzy area where it's hard to tell whether it's open source or not because are these restrictions a little bit too much? The GPL, though, I mean, just as a matter of tradition and culture, the GPL is seen as an open source license. I mean, it's like our understanding of what open source means has been shaped by the fact that we accept the GPL as an open source license. That may not be entirely satisfactory, especially if you're a critic of the GPL. But if you are not a critic of the GPL in general, it kind of makes sense. So the GPL kind of set set a line, if you will, about around like what it is legitimate for a license to do in constraining what a distributor can do, because it's mainly aimed at distribution, without the license and the software, becoming not free software, not open source, based on the license.
I mean,
So
the
that
GPL
may not
kind of
be
feels like the OG,
satisfactory.
doesn't it? The OG open source license, doesn't it? Even if we don't necessarily like it very much, it, as you say, it was.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I like it because in part because it's so interesting. Like so many interesting issues come out of the GPL, and there are so many more permissive open source licenses. We have this whole category of open source licenses. So there are basically two categories of open source license. There's permissive and there's copyleft. So the GPL typifies copyleft. If you want to understand what copyleft means, it's basically what the GPL tries to do. And then there are other licenses that try to do similar stuff in a somewhat more limited way, for the most part, and those are also copyleft licenses. And then there are permissive licenses, which is a bit of a misnomer because the GPL is pretty permissive in the scheme of things compared to like proprietary software licenses. But but permissive licenses are not very interesting from a legal perspective, I would say, on the whole. I mean, yeah, there's plenty of interesting issues that arise out of those licenses, but nothing compared to like what comes out of thinking about the GPL, because the GPL is a much more ambitious license than many of these other licenses, and it tries to accomplish an interesting set of policy goals, very successfully, I would say, on the whole. And a lot of interesting stuff that I have dealt with over the years has involved the GPL, certainly.
And actually, we had a question because I said you were going to come on here, and there was one of them was like retrospectively was V3 of GPL LTPL positive, worthwhile, return on investment? Because this is something I think happened since the GPL 3 came out, which for me, I think you played part of it, but I also know that we were told in Red Hat that some of the stuff we were doing, which GPL 3 had some limitations, and I can't even remember the detail of it. But yeah, is there anything on the GPL and the version 3? What's the difference, and has it played out as it expected? Because again, yeah, the world has changed since then. But yeah,
Yeah,
what
so
do you think?
I did work on GPL v3. So before I came to Red Hat, so I should disclose that I spent a few years at a nonprofit law firm called the Software Freedom Law Center, which at the time had the Free Software Foundation as a client. The Free Software Foundation is the steward of the GPL. So at that time period, so this was 2000, like late 2005 to I joined Red Hat initially in early 2008. So during that time period, the FSF decided to draft GPL version 3. So GPL version 2 came out in 1991. So it had been many years since there had been an update to the license. So yeah, so I worked on that prior to coming to Red Hat. So now so what are the differences? There are a number of differences in the actual license in GPLv3 relative to GPLv2. There's a lot of stuff about software patents in GPLv3, for example. There's not that much about software patents in GPLv2. There's a whole subsection, a half of a section devoted to what some call anti-TiVoization, which is an effort uh, to try to make it possible for users to install modified versions on what would otherwise be cryptographically locked down consumer devices. So a major policy goal of GPLv3 is embodied in that half of a section. There
And
is
this just remind me, just because TiVo is actually also old. Like I feel like
yes, people
maybe
probably
you
don't know TiVo.
know what TiVo is. So I get TiVo was it doesn't even exist anymore. I think it was like one of those like you get a device that could record videos for you automatically, so you don't have to watch it. Like it's like before Netflix, there's like everything was sent out globally, and you set recording on and off. And that device had, I think, Linux software in it. And I remember there was some license debate back then of like, hey, I have the software, you distribute it to me. I want the source code. But I think they were probably saying something like, this is not, you didn't actually get it. You were just borrowing device or something. I can't remember the argument.
So there's actually been some dispute over the history in recent years. So I don't know actually what the full truth is, but the perception at the time, as I remember it, and again, like bear in mind that I was like learning a lot in like that period of like 2005 to 2008. Not that I don't learn a lot now, but so the perception at the time, as I remember it, is that so TiVo had these DVRs that were based on Linux, based on some Linux distribution, and you could not you couldn't modify, like they gave you access to the source code, but you couldn't install modified versions of like the Linux kernel, for example, on the DVR. At least that's how I remember the issue. That's what I remember the issue being, and it may be that it was more nuanced than that perception suggests. But I think that was largely the perception at the time, and so that's partly what GPLv3 was trying to address in some of its provisions. So so GPLv3 is in many respects it is very similar to GPLv2, and certainly like the provisions on source code. So like what the basic requirements of the GPL are pretty simple. Like you if you distribute a binary, you have to provide the complete corresponding source code. So that's defined in a certain way. And there are some situations where it can be challenging to kind of understand what that means. But that's basically like one of the main requirements. If you distribute a derivative work, that's also another thing that's another interesting issue. Like, what is a derivative work? GPLv3 uses different terminology, but it's the same idea. Talks about modified versions. If you distribute a modified version or a derivative work, that has to be under the GPL. And it also says that distributors cannot impose further restrictions on the exercise of GPL rights. That's basically the core of what the GPL requires. And that's true of GPLv2 as well as GPLv3. And as to whether like GPLv3 has been a success or not, I think probably from the Free Software Foundation's perspective, I don't know like what they would say publicly, but I think they probably, at least at some point in time, were disappointed that they may have anticipated a more wide scale replacement of GPLv2 with GPLv3, and that's not what has happened. Instead we see a coexistence of GPLv2 and GPLv3. GPLv3 is a very popular license. It is the choice of many new projects, many projects that have sprung up since the release of GPLv3, which now many years ago, now like whatever it was, 18 years ago or so, right? So many projects interested in using a version of the GPL, interested in a copyleft license, have chosen GPLv3 for whatever set of reasons. GPLv2 continues to be widely used. There are many projects that were using GPLv2 before GPLv3 that continue on, like the Linux kernel, that still use GPLv2, and there are a lot of new projects that prefer to use GPLv2. So the two licenses have kind of peacefully coexisted, if you will, since then.
And actually it's funny because I remember back then, GPL was like a common thing I bumped into. But I'm in the Java world. Like, I think in the Java world, GPL has kind of died out. Even like LTPL has been used a lot, like Hibernate. But even Hibernate is now trying to relicense to Apache, and most licenses in Java world has gone to our like ASL, MIT, BSD kind of stuff. Which is less copylefty, I guess is the word.
Or EPL if it's a copyleft license, or ASL if it's not ASL. Is it? ASM, ASML. Oh no.
for DPL plus class path exception, right? Which I guess is probably one of the more cleaner ones. Because I think that was you, Richard, when you explained me the difference between LTPL, DPL, DPL plus class path is that DPL plus class path is what LTPL, like if that existed when Hibernate came out or something else, we would have chosen GPL plus class path exception because it's cleaner. There's no reverse engineering clause and other fun stuff. The OpenJDK was the one who started using it, I think. That they introduced the notion, I think.
It actually started with the GNU ClassPath project, which was an effort to it was an effort to kind of provide an implementation of the Java class libraries before OpenJDK was released. And so when OpenJDK was released by Sun, whenever, I guess 2006 or 2007, I can't remember, 2007 maybe, they chose the same license, the GPL2 with that license exception.
That's right. So you also mentioned another thing that I think I see Alexei here actually asked him, because I know Alexei, he also works for Red Hat, just to be transparent here. He says, stupid question, but in case something comes to mind, is there a list of popular licenses that require publishing buildable sources with distributed and rebuilt binaries versus those that don't? And you mentioned this thing, you said like the source has to be available, and I believe this license says they has to be reasonably rebuilt, like there's some phrasing there. And Alexei, one of the things Alexei is working on is actually trying to make sure that all our builds in Quarkus and stuff is compliant with licenses. So anyway, so I know that's a question, because Red Hat has an internal policy, I think, about all the source we have should be available in a buildable form. But yeah, anyway, on licenses, is there something? Is it like a list? Like is there a way to know if what is buildable and what is there any split between these? Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as I know, there's no open source license or other license that uses the term buildable. But I know what this is about. Of course, so this is coming out of the GPL again. So the GPL. Again, I said the GPL is kind of relatively interesting as a license, and this is one of the ways in which it's interesting. So the GPL says that if you distribute, I mentioned that if you distribute a binary, you have to provide the complete corresponding source code, and it tries to define what that means. And what GPL v2 at least says, the GPL v3 version of this definition is kind of more complicated, admittedly. But I think it's you kind of I like to say you have to kind of look at the GPLv2 definition to understand the GPLv3 definition. But the GPLv2 definition says that complete source code means not just the source code as such, and it also is the interface definition files, it says, and then it says the scripts to control compilation and installation of the executable. I think that that's a correct quote. And that's where this idea of buildability or rebuildability comes from. That's one of the things that the GPL is trying to ensure, that that you're not just providing the source code in some kind of general sense, but the source code is sufficient to enable that rebuildability. And a lot of the issues that come up in that I'm aware of in community GPL enforcement. So there's an organization called the Software Freedom Conservancy that is active in enforcing the GPL. They've brought at least one lawsuit directly trying to enforce the GPL. One of the issues that they talk about is this issue of the need to provide the scripts to control compilation and installation of the executable. That's this language that's in the definition in GPL v2. And actually there's some interesting questions about what that means, which is a pretty advanced topic, but it certainly means it certainly gets at this idea of buildability. So if you provided the source code, and I'll try to make this like, I don't know how to make this Java specific, because I'm not really involved in Java development, but like if you provided like the .java files, but you didn't provide I don't know if like the pom.xml file would be the, like build the build files. If you didn't provide those, that you might be able to reconstruct them with a certain amount of effort, but the view from the GPL universe at least is that would not be sufficient. So that's a GPL issue. There are so Holly mentioned that there are other copyleft licenses like the EPL. The EPL does not like have this kind of language if I remember correctly. But so now Red Hat, you mentioned that Red Hat has an internal policy around this, which is kind of important to state. So we talked about copyleft licenses. When copyleft licenses have this source code requirement, most elaborate in the GPL, but the other licenses do as well. Other copyleft licenses do as well. The permissive licenses, so that other category, these licenses do not require you to provide source code. They do generally require you to provide like copies of licensed texts and copies of replications of legal notices that are in the original source code. So Red Hat's approach is that we want to comply with both types of licenses by providing all the source code. And we also take the view that the source code, even when the GPL is not the operative license, the source code should meet that standard that the GPL states about which is getting at this idea of rebuildability. So this idea that the source code should include the scripts to control compilation and installation of the executable. That is what we expect Red Hat to do when Red Hat provides the source code. And that is partly because we it's not necessarily for a compliance reason. In the case of licenses that are not covered by a copyleft license or by the GPL or the LGPL, but it's because we sort of believe in like our understanding of what is the right sort of quantum of source code to provide to the user is shaped by our experience in kind of using and supporting the GPL, even though Red Hat uses plenty of other non-copyleft licenses. If anything, like it's more common these days for Red Hat maintained projects to use non-copyleft licenses than copyleft licenses. But our understanding of what we should be doing as a kind of I don't like this phrase, good open source citizen, but that's the only thing that kind of came into my head. As a good open source citizen, like what we try to do is provide all the source code and the source code that meets that standard that the GPL is actually aiming at.
And there's a practical benefit as well, both for us and then for the people that we're distributing the source code to, which is in terms of if there's a problem, that means that you have the maximum protection that allows you to rebuild from source to fix the problem. And so then if you lose that source, even if we weren't obliged to have, to share the source because it was the permissive license, something important and practical was lost, as well as the good citizenship.
And I might be opening a can of worms here, but I feel like this is like the elephant in the room here thing is because this is well, maybe I'm biased because Richard has educated me the last 20 years and this is how things works. But this actually has the implication you talk about, Holly, but also realization that the binaries are not the software that is available as open source, right? And I know that we had a year or two ago, or whatever it was, when there was this, let's call it the Red Hat CentOS debacle or what it was there, where Rich, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but there was at least a perception that Red Hat changed their ways and became closed source, which I know is not true, because what we just did was underline this thing that all our source would be available in a buildable form. But if you, and Richard, you should probably tell it more than me, but that was literally where Red Hat was actually applying the GPL mindset of all the licenses, so they're rebuildable and available in a community where people can contribute and rebuild and use as they see fit. But if you're engaging in a corporate agreement with Red Hat, then the pieces of Red Hat Linux, they were basically well, I'm afraid of saying the right word, but they were seen as, hey, now the source was not going to be available, which was yeah, and that's not true. But can you maybe touch on this, Richard, just to see what the difference is? Because I know you're saying, well, I know you say it and you mean it, that you're actually being a good citizen, but others actually see this behavior as not being a good citizen, because now the software, the binaries are no longer freely available, freely as in I can just use them as take them. Yeah.
Well, so this is a pretty big topic, but
Yeah.
I can say a little bit about this. The issue of the binaries not being available, actually, you have to go back way further in time to kind of talk about that. So when Red Hat was founded, so in the 1990s, Red Hat had one product, Red Hat Linux, basically one product, and Red Hat provided like public binaries and public source. And what changed in 2002 when Red Hat introduced Red Hat Enterprise.
Well,
Wow.
that
Somewhere
was a bad
there was
time.
like a big hook saying the lawyer's talking too much, get him off the stage.
Hey, Richard.
Oh,
Well,
and now he's only half back.
he got censored. That was a very
Yeah, he was about to say something really, really exciting there.
okay. That's weird. Let me try if I can get him on board. That was a
Yeah, that's the last time you ask a controversial question. It just makes the guests
apparently
go poof.
don't do that. Let me see if I can reach him on. That was funny. Fontana. Let's see. He can't hear us probably. Well, maybe he can hear us.
Yeah. There's the big red button.
Yeah. So for those who can't see, we Richard's just lost connection, but we can see he's joining. But for some reason it's not working. Let me. Oh, there we go.
We've got him. Yay!
Hey, Richard.
Sorry about that. I think what happened is, yeah, I lost power, or rather, it was not because someone pulled me away from talking about this. So wait, can I finish my thought?
Yeah. Go ahead.
You tell us.
You tell us.
So I was explaining in 2002, Red Hat introduced the Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscription business model, and part of that involved Red Hat deciding to make access to binaries a benefit of the subscription. So Red Hat continued to provide public source code for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but now you had to have a subscription basically to have access to the binaries. The binaries, by the way, are under so Red Hat distributes the binaries under open source licenses. So you have to do this for the GPL and the LGPL. There are licenses like the Apache license where you don't have to do that. You could distribute a binary under a more restrictive license, a proprietary license. But Red Hat chooses not to do that. So part of what Red Hat does is it uses open source licenses for everything. For everything it ships in something like RHEL. Open source licensed binaries, open source licensed source code. So that was 2002. So what happened last year is that Red Hat didn't change this issue of access to binaries. What Red Hat did was Red Hat has, as part of the development process for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Red Hat has what I would describe as kind of a partially open development process for RHEL, and that's in the form of this project called CentOS Stream. And CentOS Stream is kind of lets you see the RHEL team sort of developing the next minor version of RHEL in the form of public source repositories, Git repositories on GitLab. It also builds updates as they basically become available and are tested. I'm not like the right person to describe the difference between CentOS Stream and RHEL, but the point is that what happened last year was that Red Hat decided that the source code for the public source code for RHEL would basically, from that point forward, be in the form of what was being distributed through the CentOS Stream project, and Red Hat would not additionally be providing the source RPMs for the Red Hat binary packages that are released to subscription customers in RHEL. So those customers still have access, as they always have, to those source packages. But in terms of public access, the public access exists in the form of the CentOS Stream Git repositories, and the basic difference is in the form is sort of like what so CentOS Stream does not have a public notion of what a minor release is. So that is basically the difference. And so for the most part, actually patches to RHEL packages appear in CentOS Stream actually many months before they will appear in counterpart minor release updates in RHEL. So that's my attempt to explain the RHEL model. And so yes, so what happened was Red Hat was making source code for RHEL available in two different places in two different forms, and it changed to making it publicly available in one of those forms and making it available to customers in a different form, and that made people angry. But then that also led to kind of debates about like the Red Hat subscription model itself, which didn't have that much to do with the specifics of anything around these sort of changes in the approach to source availability. But that just sort of like because people got angry at Red Hat, this issue that had kind of popped up every 10 years ago or so, every 10 years or so, kind of popped up again. And I don't know, like I can certainly talk about that, but I will just say that Red Hat has not changed its business model. So one of the misconceptions that came out last year was that Red Hat had made a change to its business model. This is absolutely not true. Red Hat has had basically the same business model for RHEL and other products since 2002, since introducing RHEL. And Red Hat designed this business model to be compliant with the GPL. And I won't deny that there are some interesting questions, because the GPL is an interesting license, that have come up in the course of the years around the relationship between this business model and the GPL. But it is designed to be GPL compliant, GPL compatible, and that has shaped how it has been constructed. And again, we provide the source code, the complete corresponding source code, that GPL standard for everything in Red Hat Enterprise Linux and other distributed Red Hat products, even where we don't actually have to. And but open source licenses don't require public source availability to begin with. So open source licenses require, and I don't think there are any exceptions to this, open source licenses require that the recipient of the software have access to the source code, right? You could distribute a permissively licensed piece of software under a non-open source license, but that is no longer open source. But if you're purporting to say that something is open source, you have to have access to the source code. But the whole world doesn't necessarily have to have access in that instant. The recipient of the software has to have the freedom to give the software to the whole world. But public availability is not necessary for something to be open source. So that is an important thing to.
Yeah, and again, this is some of us are old and remember the time when there was no GitHub. There was no, everything was distributed around, and like at some point it was just on floppy disk. And this I've had many arguments with people saying like, just because it's on GitHub does not mean it's open source, and open source doesn't require it to be on GitHub. It's a very funny, So anyway, the thanks for the explanation of the Red Hat CentOS, and I'm just still smiling because you literally disappeared at the point you said, like, wait, that's not the thing. So, Richard, are you able to continue? Because I still have a few good questions. We're hitting the hour here. Is that working for you, or?
Yeah, I can continue.
Okay, because there's a few more. So on this, because someone was actually saying back then that the Rail CentOS was even worse than the BSL or something like that movement, which I always find interesting because it's like, no, you can still do what you will with the source. It might just be harder for you to replicate it in a byte-to-byte stuff. But the fun thing is, all those BSL and licenses, they literally, you're not allowed to make something that compete with the thing. Whereas Red Hat says you're allowed to compete with Red Hat. Just take this source here, and you do the work. Like there's no thing there. That's a subtle difference, but I think it's a very important one.
Yeah, I think that there's a view. I mean, this is not a legal sort of opinion, but there's a view that I've heard people at Red Hat say that with respect to RHEL and the RHEL clones, that that Red Hat wants to see a flourishing ecosystem of derivatives, of innovative derivatives of RHEL. I should say CentOS streams, like, because RHEL itself is a derivative of CentOS stream. So CentOS stream exists as a public project, kind of creates a standard, a de facto standard for what enterprise Linux is. And then RHEL is one of those derivatives. But then there are other derivatives of CentOS stream as well. And an example is Alma Linux, which had been sort of characterized as a RHEL clone, but they've kind of sort of characterized themselves as a derivative of CentOS stream. And Red Hat wants to see an ecosystem of derivatives of CentOS stream. It doesn't necessarily see value in clones of RHEL, the product, as such. And you can debate that issue if you want, but I think that's sort of a view that exists inside Red Hat.
So so this is come back to one of the questions that came out when I asked that you were here. It's like, what is the right license to choose if you are a startup that wants to start something and you have a project? Is there a right license to choose that doesn't lead to the path of going non-open source? Or yeah, yeah, it's a loaded question, I guess. But do you have, as a personal recommendation to people who want to go out there, what should they do? Should they yeah? Anyway, that was the question. Like, what license to use if you are? He called it to avoid Amazonian, which is what you refer to as to avoid being a strip mined, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you want to prevent what some people, I think, wrongly call strip mining, then that's incompatible with open source development. So open source development gives users the freedom, open source licenses give users the freedom to create services and products, including those that compete with your company. So open source gives you that freedom. And so if your goal is to not permit that, you shouldn't be using an open source model. You shouldn't be using an open source licensing model. And I would argue that maybe you shouldn't be using any sort of public development model. So we haven't mentioned this. We talked about the source available licenses, but one of the reasons why they are problematic that I think we haven't mentioned is that they involve inherently a kind of brand confusion. Like they involve companies that in multiple respects are taking advantage of the brand equity, if you will, around open source. So one thing is I mentioned, I think I did mention that the model that you often see is that companies will start off using an open source license, a true open source license, and then after the project becomes popular, partly because it was under an open source license, because that's a way of getting adoption for your project, then they switch to one of these source available licenses with restrictions in it. So that's problematic because it's sort of benefiting from open source until a certain point, and then kind of switching to a different approach. Another reason why it's a problem is that it these licenses are similar enough in the public consciousness to open source that it has a damaging effect in general on the larger kind of culture surrounding open source, because people start to think, well, it's there are open source projects with licenses like this, therefore open source legitimately can include projects under licenses that have such discriminations and use restrictions, and that's been a huge problem, I would say. So I would say that companies that think they might want to switch, and I guess they probably don't necessarily think this in advance. I don't know, but companies that contemplate doing this sort of switch should not be using an open source development model to begin with. They should just use, and they shouldn't use these source available licenses either, because they are inherently confusing for multiple reasons. And partly they're confusing because they're somewhat similar to open source licenses. They should be using traditional proprietary licenses with where it's very clear that the license mostly prohibits you from doing pretty much everything other than the ability to run the software and so forth. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. So I'll play the devil's advocate here, because I've had many fun discussions with people, because I have this, I'm of the same belief as you are, Richard, that these are hurting understanding of what open source is. And it's specifically the one that I keep coming back to is, like, let's say Elasticsearch or Redis or something, they say, hey, I've been moved. They don't move all of their stuff, but just move enough of their stuff to this either like a shared source kind of licenses, that at that point I can no longer link to their stuff. Like, it becomes hard for me to include and link it, and or even go and look at some of the source and copy code from them to be compatible with them, because suddenly it becomes, oh, I need this. I found a bug in the Redis connection. Let me go look at Redis code, but that code is not under an open source license like DPL or ASL. I actually are like, I could end up being in trouble for even just reading at the code, even though it's shared source. But one thing I do see advantage is, if I'm in that ecosystem, let's say I'm in Elasticsearch, or I'm in GetSentry, or HashiCorp or whatever, it is a value to me that I can see the source and play with it and adjust it and do bug fixes. But this is like a closed garden environment. But that's still proprietary, and why it shouldn't be called open source. So I see value in it. But I guess what you're saying is that that's okay, but just don't call it. Yeah. Like, no, you said don't even do an open source development model. Like, just be all closed. Is that because you think that's a better signal to send, because that's literally what it means effectively? Or
yeah, so admittedly, like, I think you're saying that you kind of said that, like, there's a value in access to the source code, even if it's not under a sufficiently permissive license. And I think that's true. The problem I have with the source available licenses is that they are, in practice, they are often used in a confusing way that leads people to think of them as open source licenses. So the whole meaning of open source gets kind of confused. And we haven't talked about AI, but this has actually become a big problem in AI, where there's been a sort of similar development. But yeah, it just leads to, if you care about the integrity of the definition of open source, that it kind of stands for what, that sort of set of kind of legal and technical criteria I kind of mentioned earlier, that involves sort of a sort of minimum set of permissions and this sort of non-discrimination principle. If you believe in that, then these licenses that are often described, misdescribed, false, wrongly described as open source licenses, sometimes by the companies using them, that can be very, very damaging. Sometimes the companies that use these licenses continue to call their projects open source, for example. Many times the users continue to call them open source. And so over time, what open source means starts to get watered down and lost. And that's not good.
No. And yeah, I agree with you. And it's well, I'm pretty sure in 10 years from now there'll still be debates on what's open source and what's open source. But you mentioned a magic word called AI, because that one, yeah, has all this. Anyway, you probably you know more about this than I do, but yeah, open source is being used around these models out there, and I can't even remember like. What's called Facebook, at least their model license says something like it reads like an Apache BSD license, but then it says, "Oh, if you're above certain amount of if you're under a certain amount of income, then it's fine. But if you're above, then it's not." And then that sounds like a non-open source license to me. And I've been surprised that it hasn't been pushed back in the same way as the share source license and stuff. It's been kind of like, oh, maybe there's something. So what's your angle here? What's your view on this? Yeah, anything you can give a comment on? Because I'm sure.
Yeah, it's pretty bad situation. It's in some ways the machine learning community has inherited a bad situation that the source available license using companies in the non-AI software space have kind of created. Like that's kind of like part of the problem. But like so what's happening is machine learning practitioners and companies kind of getting involved in AI and machine learning have been releasing models publicly and sort of code associated with models publicly. And this releasing these released models are commonly called open source by everyone, by the machine learning practitioners themselves, by the companies who employ them, and by the users of the enthusiastic users of these models. They are saying all of this is open source. So and this is leaving aside like the confusing name of Open AI as a company. I'm talking about the companies and individuals who are research teams that are releasing public models in repositories on Hugging Face and so forth, so that anyone in principle can access the models. This is commonly being described as open source, even though the license for the models is not always an open source license. So sometimes, so the licenses that are being used in these cases are not, when they're not open source. And so there are plenty of models that are released under open source licenses. So IBM, for example, recently released several Granite models under the Apache license. So that's an example of use of an actual open source license with an AI model. And another company that has done this with some of its models is Mistral. But there are also companies that have released models publicly under licenses that would not meet the definition of open source by a stretch. And so the Llama 2 and Llama 3 community licenses of Meta are good examples of that. So these licenses, as you mentioned, they have that restriction on certain categories of users. They also have, if I remember correctly, there's a restriction against use of the models to train other models. If I'm remembering that correctly, they're also these licenses incorporate by reference a whole set of kind of policy restrictions that in a way resemble what we were talking about earlier with the ethical source licenses. So some of the restrictive licenses that we see in the AI space are in a sense descendants of the ethical source licenses we were talking about earlier. So they have a very elaborate set of restrictions on things you can't do with the model. Some of that is very well intended, and obviously, they're in a sense getting ahead of regulation on this sort of topic. But these licenses are, they have many problems in practice. They're often difficult to interpret, and they're unlikely to be enforced. So it's not clear what they accomplish. But those licenses also are being used for models that are then described as open models or open source models, and that's a problem.
And there's this sort of the bigger question too, which is that even if you had all of that source under an open source license, often you're missing the recreatability because you don't have the training data, and you certainly, you
right.
don't have the labeling labor.
Right. So that's the other huge issue in discussions around AI and open source is like, what about this idea that a precondition for something to be open source is access to the source code. So what is the source code for a model? And I think that there's a big debate on this issue going on. I have actually, like, my views on this have shifted a little bit. I mentioned the open source initiative. So the OSI is engaged in an effort to create an open source AI definition, and it has gone in a certain direction that I consider positive, but kind of remains. It's not finished yet. It remains to be seen, like what they end up with. So this is an issue that many people are thinking about and kind of wrestling with, and certainly many of us at Red Hat are thinking about this. But yeah, central issue is, well, what does source code mean for a model? And so there's one view that the training data is the analog to the source code, if not the source code itself. And I am inclined to not be sympathetic to that view, or sympathetic is not the right word. I don't feel like it's a perfect analogy for many reasons. And so I want to be able to say that if you put the model weights under an open source license, and you provide a certain set of information about how to use the model, how to further train the model, how to use the model for inference, that and that information is in the form of code itself that is under an open source license, so that you can make improvements to the model, you can fine tune the model, you can further train the model. um, that maybe that should be enough to consider a model open source, or maybe a certain, and this is where I think the OSI is going with its definition. Maybe you need a certain set of information about how the model was trained, some disclosure of what data sets were used to train the model, and so that some degree of replicability or reproducibility is possible, even if it's not the sort of same type of reproducibility we would expect in a kind of, let's say, with like a GPL kind of source distribution scenario. That maybe should be good enough. And so, for example, IBM's Granite models have been released with a set of information about what data sets were used to train the model. But is that enough information to reproduce the model? I don't think so. And I don't think anyone is releasing models, whether under an open source license or a non-open source license, with that degree of information currently. But I think we should aspire, certainly, to um, that situation where more and more models are released with uh, more transparency and more detailed information about how the model was trained. So I think that's something that we certainly want to work towards, or I think we should work towards as an industry of companies involved in AI. And I think, I don't know if I would say Red Hat has a fixed position on this currently, but it's something that a bunch of people at Red Hat are thinking about. And I feel like maybe that's the sort of position that Red Hat is kind of moving towards. But certainly at a minimum, at a bare minimum, if you're going to like release a model publicly and call it open source, you better use an open source license for the model weights, and you better use an open source license for any code you release. And not all companies are doing this, unfortunately.
Yeah, because this is the thing. Is like when, because like 1 or 2 years ago, I guess it's only a year ago, these open source open source models were released, because they were literally, in any definition I have, is they were the binaries that were released. Like it was the result of some source that got released. Right, the weights are literally just compiled information. Um,
Yes,
but then,
I don't like that view, but I understand it. And I think many people have that view that it is,
yeah,
if if not like literally true in some sense. And some people actually, I think, believe that there really is like it the training process is like a form of compilation. I do not accept that, but there are also people who believe that, well, it's analogous to compilation. And so the training data is like the closest thing we have to source code. There's another view that the we have like data that is released under open source licenses,
yeah,
um, and we don't expect there to be a kind of source form for that data. So like you can put a JPEG or something like that under an open source license. That's actually very common in open source projects, but you aren't necessarily providing like a source form for the JPEG, or maybe a source form doesn't actually exist that's distinct from the
yeah,
JPEG itself. And so, you can take the weights. Weights are publicly released in a checkpoint file. You can inspect the weights. You can open up the checkpoint file, and you won't understand the weights in terms of like what, in a certain sense, like why the weights are there. Uh, but on the other hand, you can actually see the weights for what they actually are. So in a certain sense, that is a source form. So an interesting question, which isn't very practical, is what would it mean to put a model under the GPL? And it kind of raises some of these policy questions. The reason why it's not that practical is that there are very few models, well, very few interesting models that have been put under the GPL. So this question hasn't really come up that much in practice. But you would have to decide like what, in that kind of case, if you're distributing a model under the GPL, what would be the complete corresponding source code? And a year ago, I was on in a conference panel where I took the position that I think I took the position that the weights are enough, because there isn't a source form, a true source form for the weights. I think I would still take that position as a matter of GPL interpretation today, but I mean, you can't dismiss the policy question, which is maybe to be able to say that something is truly open in the AI space. You can't just provide the weights under an open source license. You ought to be providing some additional information, if not the training data itself. And by the way, one of the problems with just sort of expecting people to provide the training data is that you may not have the rights to provide the training data. And certainly you may not have the rights to provide the training data under an open source license. So the training data, you might be relying on doctrines that are essentially defenses to copyright. So doctrines like fair use in the United States. So these are sort of limitations on the scope of copyright. There are also countries that have carved out data mining and so forth from copyright law. So I think Japan has done this in what I think is a very enlightened form of public policy. And so that doesn't mean that you can then I don't think that means that you can take the training data and release it under an open source license. The training data may still be copyrighted training data and not permissively licensed, but you may be able to use that data for training. You may not be able to disclose the training data, and so that's one thing. Another thing is that some training data might have disclosure may not be possible because it would have data privacy implications. So it may not be possible in many cases for releasers of a model that they trained to put the training data under an open license. You may very well be able to provide adequate disclosure of what kinds of data sets you use to train the model. Even that may be difficult in some situations, but that's part of the dilemma, that it's not like source code, where the source code is basically another kind of, basically the object code that a compiler creates. is a kind of encoding or translation of the source code. With a model, it's not quite the same thing. With an AI model, it's not quite the same thing. The weights are not an encoding of any piece of the training data. The weights are the result of a set of transformations that I think are quite different in nature from what you have with compiling source code.
Is there any examples in like analogs in this, what's it called, a normal open source world, software world, where you can have an open source project that comes from something that is not open? Basically, what you tell me here is like yes, I can use the weights, right? Those I'm allowed to use. So an open source AI model, at least the one I hear you say, is like granites, where I think it's an Apache, where hey, you can take these weights, you can tweak and move them and use them and apply them with any restrictions. That's open source. But then it's or sorry, I hear you say that is open source, but then you're not able to rebuild them, which was at least an important part of the open source from the last hour.
I mean, there's a practical barrier to rebuilding as well, though, because even if you had the training data, unless you have a million GPUs in the back garden, it's not like the Linux kernel.
But that's why I was saying maybe it sounds like, if you want to be like, it's called strict or square, it's more applicable to use something like the open source license that are typically used on binaries. Like, here's a PDF, or here's a JPEG, because a JPEG there is an algorithm to get there, but it is derived from somewhere, and you can actually go and modify the JPEG and get it. You have a picture of a dog, and now you can make that dog have fluffy ears. Same thing you can do for the AI model. I can tweak and relearn the model to get better to identify something. But in both cases, I'm not able to draw the first dog. Like, I'm just not skilled enough to do that, and it was done by some artist somewhere. That seems more applicable. So I'm just wondering, why was that kind of license not what they use for AI models? It seems more applicable. These are basically open source binary blobs that you can continue to modify on, but where they came from, either an artist that made some pixels on a screen or a heavy trained model from different things, they seem analogs to me. Maybe I'm oversimplifying here, but
yeah, I guess, like, so one of the things we haven't talked about in talking about AI that is maybe, I don't know if it's relevant. Maybe it's actually kind of a separate issue, but there is it's not clear whether the model weights can actually be put under a license like an open source license effectively to begin. I mean, so obviously this is being done, and other licenses are being used as that are not open source licenses, as we've talked about. But it is not so with software. We know that at least some software at a certain level of creativity or expressivity is copyrightable, and therefore you can put the software under a copyright license. And open source licenses are not entirely concerned with copyright, but they are largely copyright licenses. It's not clear that model weights are controllable by copyright. It's not clear they're copyrightable, and therefore that kind of implies that a copyright license as such would not be an effective way of regulating use of the model. Now that's, I guess, just like kind of leave that to the side, but that's kind of lurking in the background of a lot of these discussions. That it's not, we're kind of arguing over like what the license criteria should be, not to mention like non-license criteria for you to be able to say a model is open or open source when it's not clear that the license is even enforceable. So that's something that you have to bear in mind. Something you were saying about analogies, as you were talking about that, I was thinking of a different analogy that my friend Justin Colanito, who was a lawyer at Microsoft, who also has a GitHub account, who he might use his GitHub account much more frequently than I do, which is not much at all. But he is I've had discussions with him about this topic, and he has talked about how maybe this is a little bit like the early days of open source software, before it was called open source. So back when people were still using the term free software, if not like earlier terminology, that and this is in particular about the GPL, because the GPL, in a sense, is a license that expresses the policy views of the larger community, regardless of what licensing model a project might use. That in the early days, it was necessary to bootstrap an ecosystem of open source projects, because you couldn't have you couldn't have a license that required everything in the operating system, leaving aside that SSPL issue I talked about earlier. You couldn't have a license that expected pieces of a proprietary operating system to be open, because it wasn't your operating system, because there were only proprietary operating systems. There was no Linux when the GPL got started. Linux would only happen a few years later. And so the idea of an open operating system didn't exist. An open source license operating system didn't exist. And so the first open source, so the first GPL licensed programs, at least, were applications that ran on proprietary operating systems. And so the GPL was designed to accommodate this situation. So the GPL has this copyleft requirement. I mentioned that under the GPL, derivative works have to be, if you distribute derivative works, they have to be under the GPL. That's the basic copyleft requirement. But there's an exception in the source code provision of the GPL, which we talked about, and it's called the system library exception. And it says that those portions of your binary, and remember, in these early days, we had just statically linked binaries. So your statically linked C library you don't have to provide source code for that component. And that made sense because, and people asked about this, but that made sense because it was not possible to release the source code for proprietary C libraries, because either people didn't have the source code, or if they did have the source code, it was under a license that didn't allow distribution, let alone modification.
And this is also where the build scripts come in place, because then you at least can see how this code over here was actually linked with the host source. You can actually see it.
Yeah, sort of like the flip side of the LGPL in a certain sense. So so it was necessary to have this kind of compromise in the original version of the GPL, or versions of the GPL, to enable an ecosystem of GPL licensed projects to spring up. And in fact, they did spring up. And then the Linux kernel got started. And then we had this flourishing ecosystem in Linux of largely GPL licensed projects. But we had to have that bootstrapping phase. And that need for bootstrapping is embodied in the GPL. And so Justin Colanino's view is that we have a similar situation with AI models, where we have to sort of, for the time being, tolerate a situation where we essentially have a kind of, this is not his words here, I'm kind of like reconstructing what I've heard him say, but you have to tolerate a situation where you have a proprietary training process, and in a sense, like proprietary or trade secret approaches to training a model, to get to the point where we have an ecosystem of open source licensed models, and then we can kind of gradually move towards the ideal of having more and more transparency around training data. And that may require some changes to the legal system, or clarifications by the courts. But that's something that we want to move towards. But in the meantime, we can have and benefit from open source licensed models.
But it's an interesting angle you actually say, is that the soft, like, again, I might be messing this up, but I remember this thing about, you say, GPL and source license is all about granting you copyright, and copyright comes from creative process, right? Like, this is something that someone could come up with a unique idea and put either in music notes or text or visual stuff, and that thing is copyrightable. And what you're saying is this very, I guess, that philosophical issues, like, is the output is a set of weights? Yeah, that is. I haven't thought about this, but yeah, there's no creative process. Well, depends how you look at it, but there's no, let's say, classical creative process behind it, because it's literally just, hey, run some algorithm and output. There's something there. There's no thing there.
Yeah. So copyright. Sorry.
I was just going to shift to the story of the trigonometry tables. So it used to be that if you published a book with trigonometry tables, because this was the 19th century and you didn't have calculators, there's sort of a question of, like, similar to yours, Max, is that copyrightable? Because it's not like I invented the cosine of 6. That is a fact. It's a mathematical fact.
Yeah.
But there was a huge amount of effort that went into that. And so then that effort should be protected. And so what they used to do was they used to put errors into the tables. So it would be that, the sixth digit of some insignificant cosine would have an error in it. And so then if someone else would publish a book, you could prove that they had copied your work, because you would show the same error and you'd say, you didn't recalculate these, you didn't generate this truth on your own, you copyrighted my work. So it's not about, I think, creativity in that musical sense. It's about effort.
Yeah. So there's no question that the process for training a machine learning model, or at least like the kind of large language models that are so kind of popular now, that a lot of creativity and effort goes into that engineering process. But the question is whether the output is itself a creative work, and I think that there are there are at least, like, I think, very good arguments for it not being what copyright law, what U.S. copyright law calls a work of authorship, because there is no sort of minimum quantum of creativity and originality and expressivity in it, even though the process for creating it did involve a certain amount of creativity. So yeah, that is but that is certainly something that is a topic of debate.
It sounds like it'll be fun in 10 years from now to have a follow-up and see what far we got on that one. I just wanted, because we had a few these random, or not to say random questions, but there's one here from Douglas Allen. This is more about the CentOS thing, right? He says, I joined late. What about startups that create a SaaS-based product? Is it okay to start out with using the Red Hat open source tech stack? No source code distribution being SaaS. And then he says, should we be concerned because now IBM is in the picture? I think he's just asking if, like, can I as a startup use a Red Hat open source tech stack? Whether that's the Red Hat product or CentOS, I don't know, but I'll take a stab. You can tell me if I'm wrong. It's like Red Hat does not have a limit on what you use the software for, so you are fine, right? The question is just, are you getting support? Are you able to do updates? That's a different thing. That's not something that open source software gives you.
I think the part about no source code distribution being SaaS, I think there's a question about the GPL aspects, and I think that's maybe what they're driving at there. Of, if I use GPL software for my startup, am I now obligated to release my proprietary code as GPL?
Yeah, that's probably a fairly easy question. I mean, the GPL, so GPL v2, GPL v3, are their requirements, their copyleft requirements are triggered by distribution, and distribution is understood, at least I would say customarily, to mean you're actually transferring bits to a third party. So that is what triggers the source code requirement, the copyleft requirement. So if you're just providing a service and the service happens to be let's say the service is running on ultimately on Linux. The fact that Linux is under the Linux kernel, let's say, is GPLv2, doesn't mean you have to distribute the source code for the Linux kernel. Even if you made some modifications to the kernel that potentially the community might benefit from, the GPL doesn't require this if you haven't actually distributed the kernel binary. And actually GPLv3 is very explicit about this. GPLv3 has a sentence that says mere, what does it say? I used to know it by heart because I think I wrote it, but I have to paraphrase it now. It basically says that to provide software merely as a service is not distribution. That's not the language that GPLv3 actually uses, but that's the gist of it. There is a variant of GPLv3 called the Affero GPLv3, AGPLv3, which does in fact try to require source distribution in some situations for when you are deploying a service. But even the AGPL has limits on its scope, just as the GPL has limits on its scope. So it wouldn't be like we mentioned the SSPL, which MongoDB introduced. The SSPL is in a sense a response to the AGPL, which MongoDB used to use. I think MongoDB found that the AGPL was not sufficiently restrictive for its goals because it had limits to its scope, and so they designed the SSPL to kind of go beyond those limits and kind of reach to the entirety of a software stack that was implementing a service. So hopefully that partially answers the question.
I hope it is. And I'll put this as the last question because now we've gone on for almost 2 hours. I have more, but this is one because it kind of relates to the stuff we had before. This is actually Sasha Labre, which you know from before. Do you see the journey towards companies switching from open source to non-open source? So these are the ones you talked about, as increasing or decreasing? He's saying amplifying or the pendulum going back. So yeah, basically, do you think more people or more companies are going to do this, or are they going to follow, as you said, like just not do open source and just be in their own closed world? Where do you see the trend going?
I think it's too early to say where the trend is going to be. Like, I personally hope that these source available licenses go away, like the SSPL and the business source license. I unabashedly do not like these licenses for the reasons I have explained, and maybe additional reasons. So I hope they go away, but I don't know if I see right now. I think they are still an option that a certain type of company, a certain type of startup typically is going to explore. What I hope to see happen, and I think may happen, is that it will be learned through experience that switching from open source license models to these non-open source license models doesn't solve the business problems of these companies, that they basically have a business model problem that they're trying to solve through a community project licensing approach, and that is not, you can't solve a business problem through a switch to a different kind of licensing paradigm to a large extent, at least. So I am hoping that these kinds of companies will realize this in the near future, and that we will see less of this kind of licensing model in the future. But I think it's too soon to say.
Well, and it just because now you said it, and I kind of agree with you. But you were saying before, I said, what's the recommended way? You said, well, just don't go open source if open source is not for you. I'm paraphrasing you here. But I guess would an open core model work where the basis is let's say open source, and then you add extensions or plugins or whatever that is closed? I guess that will stay compatible with your values, I think, because then there's no.
Yeah, I don't like open core either. Like but
If you had to choose, I guess. Well,
if I had to choose between source available and open core, I don't know. That's a very difficult choice.
okay.
I guess like I think there are versions of open core that are somewhat more benign than I think it's kind of in a way it's easier to criticize the source available licenses. Um, I think they're both bad. In some ways, they're both bad for similar reasons. So one common problem is that open core models also embody this confusion over what open source means. So you have like a company that has a community project that, yes, it's under an open source license. Then they will have a product that, and this is typically not the approach Red Hat takes in terms of naming the product, so typically Red Hat will try to have a differently named commercial product or enterprise product from the counterpart community project. In the open core space, we typically see the same brand name being used for both the community project and the commercial version, which is going to have the open source core, but with various proprietary enhancements that are not part of the open source version. And so that leads to this kind of same type. It's a different kind of confusion over like what is open source and what open source means, and it's a different form of the problem of proprietary non-open source software sort of benefiting from the brand equity, if you will, that's associated with open source. So that is one of the problems with open core. There are other problems as well. I think of Red Hat as being a company that has steadfastly chosen not to engage in, not only like this source available approach, but also has refused to engage in like the open core model approach to sort of open source based business models, and I'm pretty proud of that legacy of Red Hat's, because Red Hat has shown there's a different approach where you can have an entirety of a product be under open source licenses. We can provide the source code to our customers, to our users, under open source licenses. We provide the binaries under open source licenses, so there's no like proprietary only components containing like the secret sauce or the enhancements. That's not Red Hat's approach. And so Red Hat has found a different model using a subscription approach, and that has worked very well for Red Hat. And I am certainly very proud of that fact. So I don't like open core really any more than source available.
Gotcha. And I think we will leave it at that. That was a good ending. So thank you, Richard. And yeah, sorry for listening. We had gone on for 2 hours, but I thought it was really, really good. So we will end it here, and stay around, Richard. And but otherwise, good luck, and see you in years again.